All right, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Russ Palarea. Dr. Palarea received his PhD at University of Nebraska under Mario Scalora, who's sort of one of the anchors in the field of threat management. Dr. Palarea has a career that's as notable as Dr. Mulvey's. While Dr. Mulvey has been on the scientific side, Dr. Palarea has been with any number of federal agencies. He's been with NIS for 10 years, Diplomatic Security at the Department of State, Department of Defense, Homeland Security, any number of other intelligence groups, as well as his own private clients through his company, Operational Psychology. Currently, he is the president of a group called the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals, which is the national organization that brings together law enforcement, investigative, intelligence, security, and behavioral health professionals to look at intentional and targeted violence. Just a quick show of hands. Any ATAP members in the room? Okay, a couple of us. Okay, so if you're interested in hearing more about the group, look for the people who just raised their hands. We're happy to tell you more about our group. Finally, while not a native Pittsburgher, Russ does boast that on a prior trip to our town, he managed to get a Permanis not once but twice in the same day. So with that, Russ. All right.
Good morning. It's truly an opportunity both to present at this symposium with these esteemed colleagues on a very important topic, but also to be able to return to Pittsburgh. My best friend graduated from Pitt, and I was indoctrinated by the ways of Permanis twice in the day. And also, I know how to intelligently speak about why Old Mill was so much better than Garfield. Kennywood fans? Okay. They should not have renovated Old Mill. I learned that lesson that day. Garfield was not a good creation. So, but it was a fantastic visit to Pittsburgh, the Burgh, and it is a pleasure to be back today. What I'm going to discuss today is I was raised in the world that Dr. Mulvey just spoke about, which is clinical psychology and forensics, and specifically studied the same violence risk assessment topics that Dr. Mulvey just presented. Where I took that information was to apply it into a world called operational psychology. And I work with special agents, intelligence analysts, and operators to understand violence risk from an academic and clinical and forensic perspective out on the street. What do we do when somebody actually communicates a threat to kill their employer, the Secretary of State, any number of individuals, bomb a facility, commit a mass shooting, conduct a terrorist attack? So my background and the perspective I'm going to bring to you today is one of an operator, a person who works cases. Now, this came up at dinner last night, so I decided to humor the speakers from our dinner and actually offer this photo up. For the rest of you, the relevance is, how many of you are fans of the NCIS TV show? Okay, there's a handful of you. How many of you have ever seen the NCIS Los Angeles show? That LL Cool J, Chris O'Donnell one? How many of you remember the character Dr. Nate Getz? Nobody, one. Okay, well, so that's me. Dr. Getz is the relevance of this is Dr. Getz is the first and only operational psychologist on television or in film. And the result of him getting on this show, his character, that's Peter Cambor, the actor, the producer of the NCIS show came to NCIS headquarters when I was working there, and I had lunch with him and told him about what operational psychologists do for the agency and our mission. And he said, "It's a show about relationships. You're a psychologist. We'll need a psychologist on the show." That's a bad Australian accent. And I said, okay. And the next thing you know, I'm out in LA working with the writers, meeting with the actor, and talking about what operational psychologists do. So they did have Dr. Getz on the show for, I believe it's the first 2 years. And then he conducts occasional cameo appearances now because the writers didn't know what to do with the operational psychologist. But if you are familiar with Dr. Getz and operational psychology, I'm here to correct what the writers did when they misinterpreted what operational psychology is. They had Dr. Getz kill a guy. True story. because there was an undercover, LL Cool J was undercover, busting up a Yemeni terrorist cell in prison, and somebody blew LL Cool J's cover, and they were about to go rat him out, and Dr. Getz was the only one who could intercept the bad guy in the hallway, and twisted his head and dropped him like a sack of potatoes. When I met with the writers and the actor and the producer, the first time I visited the set, I gave them the APA Code of Ethics, American Psychological Association Code of Ethics. True story. Because I knew this was going to happen. I predicted that this was going to happen. And I told them, this is the APA Code of Ethics. Do not violate it. Do not violate it. That's how I said it. And the writers looked puzzled at me, and the producers said, ethics, that's drama, that's conflict. And I said, yeah, you get it. You can do great ethical conflicts in the script, but not bring us to the point where you're going to violate them. And of course, killing people would probably constitute a violation of our code of ethics. I think as a footnote, do no harm. So that happened. But what I want to bring you to today is the story of operational psychology, applying forensic clinical work to operators, specifically special agents and investigators that are investigating threats of violence and moving to mitigate those violence and how we get there. I do appreciate that our topic today is violence committed with firearms. But I want to remind the audience that threat assessment is much more than gun violence. We have the topic of mass shootings specifically, and I do have worked threats of mass shootings. I can say that I prevented 2 of them with certainty, where we had the guy who had firearms, had targeting package, had written his suicide notes. He was right up to that point where he was going to commit an attack. And we did get him arrested and get him prosecuted and got him out of that mindset of using violence to solve his problem. And we helped solve the problems that were angering him in the first place. And to this day, he has not moved forward toward the idea of committing that attack that we thwarted. So we're mindful of this, and this is the one that happened at my former work site, the Navy Yard, which was next door to NCI's headquarters, the NAVC building. Focusing beyond targeted violence. Keep in mind that we have people that commit mass stabbings. We had mass stabbings in London, we had a slashing attack. We have this gentleman, Mr. Quick, who committed a mass stabbing at Lone Star College. Stabbings are more frequent in some overseas venues such as China, where we're worried about guns. In China, they're worried about stabbings. Now, in Europe, when I present on targeted violence, they say, yes, you Yankees with your guns. Over here, we're worried about bombings. So keeping in mind, it's also stabbings. It's also vehicular attacks. We've had a number of attacks where individuals who were inspired by Islamic extremism committed vehicular attacks. This one was not. This was a gentleman who drove through on the sidewalks of Times Square, you may recall. His ultimate goal was suicide by cop. He had nothing to do with Islamic extremism. And of course, bombing. And there was that recent attack in the New York subway system. So keep in mind today that while we focus on gun issues and gun violence, we want to keep a broader perspective on preventing all types of violence. How do we prevent targeted violence? It's a 3-step process. The first thing we want to do is educate the public, and that goes back to the Department of Homeland Security mantra of see something, say something. The challenge we have with the public is what are we looking for and who do we report to? The way that I talk about it when educating folks is if you have a concern, report it. If you have a concern that violence may happen, report it. Let the investigators investigate it and figure out what it is and then what we need to do about it. So most of my time is spent at Tier 2, which is training those investigators, law enforcement folks, and also threat assessment teams that work for corporations, for schools, and other entities about how to take that call, what questions to ask, and then dispatch that investigator to go gather records, gather evidence, conduct interviews, and bring back the information, which I then analyze to provide a threat assessment, an assessment of violence risk or concern for violence risk, and then implement a management strategy in order to do our best, our due diligence to prevent the violence from happening. Tier 3 is the folks that manage it. We call them threat management partners. And the partners can be the folks like Dr. Rozelle's work in the emergency room, when they drop off someone and say, we believe he's a danger to self or others, and that emergency room psychiatrist conducts the interview to determine whether or not they can hold the person for 48 hours, and sometimes they may be held longer than that and treated. There's also arrest, using the criminal justice system rather than the mental health system. But there's a bunch of other techniques that a lot of times law enforcement and the folks who are in the emergency psychiatry business aren't able to get their hands on, which is leveraging social networks. So a lot of what I train law enforcement investigators to do is build relationships with those family, friends, coworkers, neighbors, and have them serve as our trusted resources, that they keep an eye out on the subject, that they call law enforcement and say, hey, he just went and picked up his gun and said, I'm doing it. Be aware he's coming. And before it ever gets to that point, for those trusted resources to talk with the subject and simply get them to change their mind. Don't do this. Don't hurt anybody. Find a better way to solve your problem. You're angry with school, change schools. You hate your boss, quit your job. Don't kill your wife because you're angry with her, just get a divorce. Break them out of the tunnel vision so that they find healthier ways to cope with their problems rather than using violence as a means to solve their problem. I get a number of requests for active shooter response training. It's the wrong thing to ask for. It's important to have crisis response plans. We need to know if something happens, what do you do? Where do you go? How do you act? And I grew up in California where we grew up with the earthquake drills, right? Earthquake drills, you stop, duck underneath the desk, get in the door frame. It was interesting to watch the earthquake happen in Mineral, Virginia. I was on Quantico that day, and my coworkers who had never been in an earthquake literally freaked out and running out the door. And I'm just sitting there with about a 5.2 going, oh yeah, you could surf this. This is all right. It wasn't, when you get to 6 is when you get nervous. But the idea is we do need crisis response plans. We do need to know what happens in a moment of crisis. But it's not the full answer to the question. Rather than focusing just on active shooter response, why don't we focus on active shooter prevention? Don't wait till the house is burning down to then figure out what to do. Threat assessment is prevention. Little bubbles in a pot of boiling water, building up to a full boil, but not yet burning down the house. The idea is if you're in a corporation and someone communicates a threat, I've had it with that boss, I'm gonna make him pay, then refer him to HR, conflict resolution, the ombudsman's office, EEO. There are mechanisms in place. The same thing at schools, using student affairs. Find conflict resolution mechanisms so that these things do not boil up to the point where the house is burning down. And if it does become a security issue because there is a concern for violence risk, that's when we activate the threat assessment team. In a little bit, you're going to hear from Mark Folman, who I highly respect. He has done a great job of finding where the fails were in journalists' reporting based on assumptions rather than data, and created the database that he still houses at Mother Jones. And Mark came out to the ATAP conference a couple years ago, interviewed a bunch of us, and learned about what threat assessment is. This article that he published, Inside the Race to Stop the Next Mass Shooter, is my single go-to whenever I'm trying to explain what threat assessment is. I highly encourage you to read it if you haven't. I highly encourage you to share it with others when they get into this debate of, oh, you can't stop a mass shooting. I'll do that at a cocktail party, on an airplane. Anytime there's a captive audience and someone asks that inevitable question, so what do you do? My response is, well, I stop mass shootings and terrorist attacks. They say, oh, well, but you can't stop those. No, you can. Here, let me send you an article. Rather than getting into an argument, hey, just read this and then let's talk. Because he does such a good job of speaking from a layperson's perspective in explaining what threat assessment is, how it works, and how it has to keep going over time. It's not a one-shot deal. It's staying with the person through resolving their perceived conflict, and then being sure that they don't go into another perceived conflict afterward and escalate again. So threat assessment professionals, we are out there. We are a small number, but it's great to see we have ATAP members here today. I'm the current president of the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals, and a little bit on ATAP. We were started in 1992. Mark is actually going to mention the watershed case that began the formation of LAPD's Threat Management Unit, the first anti-stalking unit in the country, in 1990, and then the formation of ATAP by the lieutenant who ran LAPD TMU in 1992. That's the murder of Rebecca Schaefer, an actress who was murdered by Robert Bardo, who is an obsessed fan. With the formation of ATAP in 92, we started pulling together, as you can see by our logo, a truly multidisciplinary group of folks from the medical and behavioral sciences profession, law enforcement, prosecutors. Now it's built out to include the education community, the corporate community, and victim advocates and victim assistance professionals. We have a very broad base of now 1,700 plus members all across the country who meet once a year in Anaheim, California, Disneyland Hotel, but it's Anaheim, California, for our threat management conference, and now we have a second conference on the East Coast for it's Disney World, Orlando, for our ATAP Winter Conference, which we just held a couple weeks ago. We also have 14 chapters across the country. The chapter for Pittsburgh is the DC chapter. Pittsburgh is a satellite under DC where we have a local meeting site, usually Carnegie Mellon University. And for those of you that are doing threat assessment work and would like to come to one of our meetings, you can talk with Jack about him sponsoring you as a guest and bringing you into a meeting where you can learn from threat assessment professionals about how we identify, assess, and manage violence risk. I do want to point out that it's not just ATAP. Several years ago, the Canadians had been attending our conference. They decided to set up their own association, and they've been going strong for over about 13 years now. In 2008, the European Association, a couple of their folks have been attending our conference. They started up an association, and they've been going strong now. And a few years ago, the Asia Pacific Association founded. We all have our mutual agreements to work in partnership. We are all co-sponsors of the Journal of Threat Assessment and Management, which is published by the American Psychological Association. We all work in unison and attend each other's conferences, and are working together to create threat assessment in a global community. So I want to be able to explain the term prediction, which Dr. Mulvey discussed in his presentation, becomes something different when you're working in the operational world. Threat assessment is not focused on prediction because we don't believe in predicting human behavior. A subject may not know, they may be angry, they may have procured a weapon, but they may not know if and when they're going to commit that attack. They may be deliberating about it. So what we look at instead of prediction is assessment. And using the assessment cycle, how to spot a concern, how to investigate that concern, assess the information you have, analyze it, and then manage that risk. And assessment is ongoing and continuous. It is not a one-stop process. It goes on as long as there is a concern for violence risk. And the footnote there is that if there is a concern for violence risk found in the threat assessment, you must develop a management strategy. We can't say, yes, we're worried, and walk away. If there is a concern, we must develop a management strategy. The threat assessment principles, the model of behavioral-based threat assessment was created by Dr. Robert Fein and Brian Vossekuil, who is a retired Secret Service agent, and Nate Holden, first published back in 1995 in a research in brief. The Secret Service set up the National Threat Assessment Center, and their goal was to conduct research and provide expertise in how to prevent presidential assassination and, in a larger scope, assassination of other public figures. They founded the behavioral-based threat assessment model based on these three principles, and the principles still hold true, and this is the model that we all practice within the ATAP community. Targeted violence is their term. They're the ones that coined the term. Targeted violence means that you have a subject who's moving toward committing an attack against a given target. That target could be a facility, it could be a person, it could be an organization or an entity. Targeted violence is a result of an understandable and often discernible process of thinking and behavior. So you'll have people think about committing an attack, they will research the conduct, they will conduct attack preparation behaviors, and ultimately carry out that attack. That's the foundation of clinical psychology, or individual factors. Secondly, we have social psychology, which is that violence is an interaction between the subject, past stressful events in their life, a current situation, and that target, the perfect storm of things coming together where someone moves toward committing the attack. And the third is that the subject will display attack-related behavior along their continuum of idea to action, of researching it, of preparing for it, of procuring weapons or conducting surveillance before they finally move toward the attack. A second key concept posed by the Secret Service, Fein, Vossekuil, and Holden's publication is the difference between making a threat and posing a threat. Some people will make threats and never pose a threat. My cousin would often be threatened by my uncle, "I'm gonna rip your lungs out. Go clean your room, go wash up for dinner." That was the common threat that I heard in their house growing up. My cousin still has both lungs. And the reason is my uncle's motive, he never laid a hand on my cousin. He was trying to motivate my cousin to do a desired act. So if somebody threatens the Secretary of the Navy saying, "I want my benefits back and you, sir, have the ultimate authority for the Department of Navy, and if I don't get my benefits back, there will be hell to pay," doesn't intend on committing the act, they just want their benefits. But the challenge is that they may actually get more frustrated in that process of not getting their benefits back, and they may actually go buy a gun and say, "Mr. Secretary, if you don't give me my benefits back, I'm gonna put 2 in your head." And when they buy that gun, it shows movement toward the credibility of committing that act. So now they did communicate a threat, they made a threat, now they pose a threat. And the third group are the ones who pose a threat but never make a threat. And the reason they don't want to make a threat is because they don't want to be stopped from committing their attack. If you tell the Secretary of State that you want to kill them, diplomatic security will be giving you a knock on your door, a stern talking to, and may arrest you for communicating that threat because it is a violation of criminal law. There are a number of myths that come with targeted violence. The one I want to highlight here is this idea that people snap. This is not a psychotic break. Nothing is snapping in the person. It's a decision to commit violence. Sometimes that decision may be impulsive and emotionally based. It is still a decision. There is still accountability for this behavior, not snapping. So if the one thing that you walk out of this room today with from my presentation is please remember people don't snap. People make decisions to commit violence. And in targeted violence situations, that decision often is a burning grievance that builds over time or seeking notoriety and infamy that builds over time. The behavioral-based threat assessment strategy, the model, is to look at the subject's mindset and behavior before they commit the attack. We will look at their history, specifically what is their history of violence, not just criminal history, but violence history. Domestic violence, bar fights, street brawls, confrontations with people. When do they use violence? How do they use violence? In what context? Are substances involved? What's the nature of that grievance that drives this violence? So we look at historical factors, we'll look at patterns of behavior to establish that baseline and watch for change as they are moving forward toward committing the violent act. We assess their current life stressors. We will look for attack preparation behaviors. And my 2 key words in any threat assessment, I identify motivation and intent. Why is the person doing this and what is their desired outcome? Then place them on the idea to action continuum. How close are they to carrying out that violent act? And if there's a concern of violence, we implement the management plan. Keeping in mind that this process is ongoing and continuous. As Dr. Mulvey mentioned, people's lives change, life stressors change, motivation to commit violence changes, use of substances changes. So it's never a one-stop, here we are, here's your threat assessment, and walk away. Once I get involved in a case, it's ongoing and continuous until there is no longer a concern for violence risk. Open-ended assessment. Where we want to identify, and this is language that I borrowed from my graduate work on stalking and domestic violence, frequency, recency, and severity. Those are terms used in domestic violence assessment when you have patterns of behavior of assault. I use that for threat assessment. How frequent do these threats are issued? When was the recent one? What was the worst one? Identifying patterns of behavior so that we can watch escalation and de-escalation over time. There are a couple different reasons why somebody commits a targeted violence attack and, for the purpose of today, an act of gun violence or specifically a mass shooting. Perceived grievance is one that's taken a long time to train the public to understand, but the public seems to be there now. If someone goes and commits a shooting at their school, and it turns out that they didn't like that group of students, it turns out that they had an issue with their faculty member giving them a failing grade. If somebody goes and commits an attack against their former boss because they were terminated from the job, we get that now. It doesn't excuse the behavior. The behavior is still completely inexcusable, but we need to understand why somebody did that act, and perceived grievance is tending to make more sense now in the media reporting and to the public, to where now the issue is if they don't see perceived grievance, what's the motive? And that question's been coming up a lot regarding the Las Vegas attack. Perceived grievance, I liken it to kindling in a spark. We look for triggering events in threat assessment cases. What is going to make this person decide to commit that violent act? Is it termination from the job? Is it reprimand from the job? In some cases, Richard Farley in Northern California back in 1988 came back 2 years after he was terminated and committed a mass shooting in his workplace. So these cases sometimes will have a long burn, a long fuse till the time when you finally see that attack happening. But perceived grievance generally, understanding the concept of kindling in a spark to where someone commits that attack, is being more readily accepted in the public and by the media and reported on. Psychopathy is a whole different animal. Psychopathy, you guys may remember back in the day, serial killers, right? 1970s, 1980s. Serial killers aren't happening as often now because law enforcement's more effective at catching them before they can run into their string of murders. But psychopathy still exists. Some people want to kill people. Some people actually receive joy or pleasure from killing, harming people, or otherwise causing chaos within people. Psychopaths don't always kill people. But when somebody can kill and not have any remorse about it and not have a conscience, that's psychopathy. We do need to keep in mind that psychopaths will pop up in these cases. And when you don't see that perceived grievance, psychopathy may be the reason. The guy just went and committed a mass shooting and there's no reason why. Well, we have to look at psychopathy as a potential explanation. And we are not seeing the media talking about that, but we are seeing psychologists who are being interviewed by the media occasionally referencing psychopathy as a key risk factor in these cases. And a third thing to look for is notoriety. Before Cho committed the attack at Virginia Tech, shooting a video, making a video, and sending it to NBC News, that's seeking notoriety. And notoriety, whether it's for perceived grievance or for psychopathy or other reasons that a person commits the attack, some of these cases people will be seeking notoriety. And that's where we focus today's discussion involving gun violence with the media and what are the media effects that may fuel further violence. Notoriety is something we must watch for and we must temper. Sometimes people will commit these attacks to make their mark in history. And the way they make their mark in history is by receiving attention after the attack, and that's where the media comes in. So if I receive a call from a client and they say, hey doc, I got a case, and they may say, this guy just threatened to shoot his boss, then we know there's a workplace issue. My question back to that investigator is, okay, what's going on in the person's life? And they always inevitably say, doc, why you gotta be such a psychologist? It's because I am, bear with me. What's going on in the person's life? Tell me about his marriage. Healthy, unhealthy? Is she his rock? Are they getting divorced? Is it an ugly custody battle? Why are they getting divorced? In his mind, is he blaming the divorce on the fact that his workload has prevented him from being healthy in that marriage? So we need to understand what's going on in the home, what's going on with family members and friends, other relationship stressors, his own physical and mental health, and I say his, but hers applies just as much, and also financial issues. All these things relate to each other. I use a hybrid of clinical psychology and social psychology, explaining to investigators and threat assessment teams from a cognitive behavioral perspective, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are what we're going to assess in this situation. But we also need to account for context. How and when are these threats being communicated or these attack behaviors coming out? Because context means everything to the situation. So we're going to watch emotional stress increase and violent thoughts increase, and violent thoughts feed emotional stress, and emotional stress feeds violent thoughts until we finally reach that point where the subject decides to commit an attack. I'm going to fly through these really quickly to get to the end. Rage, fear, jealousy, depression, helplessness, hopelessness, despair, especially watching for despair. When someone feels that they're at the end of the rope and there's no other solution to their problem is when they may resort to violence as a solution. Believing that they're taken advantage of, undermined, cheated on, paranoia, persecution, entitlement, and another key risk factor, confirmation of beliefs. If the person believes that their boss is undermining them and then something happens and they say, see, that's evidence, he is trying to undermine me, that's it, he's dead. We watch for confirmation of his beliefs. Let me pop to here. The holistic threat assessment model, I first proposed this model at the ATAP conference in 2007, that's the reference. Using clinical, social, and organizational psychology blended together to watch for not all risk factors, these are just some of the risk factors that we look for in a case. The history of the violence and the context of the violence. And do they use weapons? And how do they use weapons? Do they threaten before the violent act? What do they say they're going to do, such as, I'm going to kill my ex-wife, and then I throw a brick through her window and I slash her tires to further terrorize her. That's called stalking. So we look at all of these contextual factors and historical factors and behavioral factors. We also look at their social support network, the people that could be trusted resources that may aggravate or mitigate the situation, their workplace concerns, their other life stressors, and their resources. Coming to the point on media effects, what influences ideation in a subject? Media and current events are a key factor, not the only one. The person's skills and abilities also has an effect. If someone is an owner of firearms, it doesn't mean they're going to use firearms to commit an attack. They could run over someone with a car. But if they own firearms and they practice with firearms and they're used to using firearms, they may be thinking more about using a gun rather than a car. So pop culture, skill sets, personal experience, and then media and current events. When we look at media effects, a couple of things to keep in mind. In some cases, this is not every case, in some cases, planting the seed. When an incident occurs, an attack occurs, and you have that person that is kindling and they're waiting for that spark, and when they see on the news, well, this guy went and shot up the mall, and you know what, that works for me too. And so that guy decides to go shoot up a food court. So we can't say in every case that happens, but we do need to look into the case and specifically look for evidence in that investigation. Were they gathering information on people who had committed targeted violence attacks before? Were they following news media? Did that influence their decision to commit the attack? The second photo up there is mimicry. The idea that someone is actually going to emulate an attack by carrying out their own, saying, you know what, that guy said he was the Joker in Aurora, Colorado, I'm the Joker. And dressing up as the Joker and committing an attack to emulate what was done in Aurora, Colorado. And the third is infamy. Some people do these attacks, such as the one in Las Vegas, in order to set, I hate to use the term, that new bar, but in order to achieve that next level of infamy, that they know that once this thing happens, a Wikipedia page will be created by someone on their attack, and they will go down in history as that attacker of that case. Now that I've scared the bejesus out of you on the current state of mass shootings and targeted violence, I will conclude with threat management. This is the good story. Once we've identified that there's a concern for violence risk, what do we do about it? Of course, we want to prevent the violence, but here's a second thing we must keep in mind: resolving the perceived conflict. If someone's angry because they didn't get a passport approved for their trip and they missed their trip, and they threaten the National Passport Agency, well, then that threat may escalate into violence. And if we can figure out what went wrong in that passport situation and actually help them get that passport, if they do in fact legitimately should be given that passport, then let's go ahead and resolve that problem. Hey, if we can get the guy's VA benefits back, get it back to him, resolve the problem. And then in some situations, that person will no longer be violent. Sometimes it's a situation, sometimes it's the person. And sometimes some people will have problems no matter where they go and what they do and continue to threaten violence. And those are the folks we have those long-term threat management cases on. So here's a hierarchy. This is just my hierarchy. This is not everyone's for threat management, but you'll see 3 levels. The first level involves talking with people, counseling the subject on their behavior, advising them not to hurt anybody, and helping them solve their problem. Advising the folks who are around that subject to keep an eye on them, those trusted resources. The second level is going into physical security measures, taking administrative actions in a workplace to hold the person accountable, having them go to employee assistance programs or get into some kind of psychological counseling, and if needed, a protection order. And the third level is actual confinement in a hospital or in a jail or prison. And we do that through leveraging the person with their organization, their school, their workplace, their whatever, workplace or school, we'll leave it at that, that they may be enrolled in or working for. Social management, leveraging family, friends, neighbors, and anyone else who can help us monitor their behavior and convince them not to act out violently. Psychological management, getting them into some type of treatment, counseling. Physical management, which is hardening the target, increasing physical security, confiscating access badges. And then legal management, that's restraining orders, arrests, and convictions. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or call, and I'll be around throughout the day. Happy to help educate anyone who's willing to listen about what threat assessment is and how we prevent these attacks. Thank you.
We're gathering our questions. All right, so all right, so can we do more to prevent violence if we intervene when initial criminal act is committed by compelling offenders' acceptance of mental health services to avoid criminal justice consequences such as jail? And sort of, speak a little bit about some of the roles of, the other stressors, job loss, family losses, as we manage violence risk.
Okay, so let me get on the first question first, and then we'll see if we do the second one. The first question, it really goes toward the issue of using diversion services in the criminal justice system. Can we refer people to mental health treatment rather than locking them up in order to prevent future acts of violence? I do want to point out that, yes, in questions where there is some type of need for mental health treatment, that can be helpful. But we want to highlight what Dr. Mulvey spent his talk focusing on, which is a lot of violence is conducted by people who don't have mental illness. So keep that in mind. And then keep in mind, when you ever ask a psych, you're going to get, well, what type of crazy? Are we talking about psychotic disorders, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, personality disorders, substance abuse disorders? Because that's the question about what type of treatment is needed and how that will effectively mitigate future violence risk. So absolutely, we can use diversion services. Sometimes when people go to prison, it changes their mind on committing future acts of violence. But those of us that have worked in forensic institutions know that some people could care less about being locked up. And they'll go right back out and commit their crimes again and then get right back locked up again. So do keep in mind that sometimes treatment is not a deterrent because people actually believe in violating the rights of others or harming others, or they could care less about others. And other times treatment can be effective, counseling or medication, always talking with somebody, in addition to medication, to help the person figure out how to live a more pro-social life and not harm others and violate others' rights.
This person says, it makes sense intuitively, but what's the evidence or research that notoriety and fame is a motive or rationale for violence, especially since many attackers can't be interviewed? Mm-hmm.
That goes back to the case-by-case basis, investigating their phone, their computer, talking with people who knew that person leading up to the attack. And especially highlighted in the case of Mr. Cho, when you shoot a video, I can't say that, when you record a video, I'm trying to be careful with my language, when you record a video and send it to NBC News, that is seeking of notoriety. Now, to conduct a research study on that, we could go back and do a retrospective study of, say, mass shooting attacks and identify In which cases do we have concrete evidence that there was a seeking of notoriety? One of the cases that Mark will talk about, that he and I went to Heston, Kansas, and did a training for the community following the Excel Industries workplace mass shooting. And in that case, Mr. Cedric Ford could care less about the notoriety. It wasn't about notoriety. It was about him shooting up his workplace that day. But in other cases, you can see where somebody is looking for that media attention. On the case-by-case basis, we would review a case and see, is notoriety a factor?
And as you talk about monitoring cases, actually a question that just came up, a little bit about sort of when do you choose to monitor someone? How long does that monitoring last? And what's the end point of that monitoring?
So monitoring, think about assessment and management. First, we needed to conduct the investigation to perform that threat assessment. We implement the management plan. We assess if that plan is working or not. The subject may respect the boundary that we have imposed. They may probe the boundary, or they may violate the boundary. Think about it. A restraining order is taken out. They leave that target alone. They come 102, 101. Hi, I'm not violating 100 yards, but I see you. You can't stop me. That's a probe. And then a violation is nothing's going to stop me, and they immediately violate that boundary. So what we will do is put a boundary in place, and then the monitoring happens. The monitoring can continue, for me, it's until we no longer have a concern for violence risk. And that's where we look at trying to resolve the subject's problems so that it reduces their motivation to commit violence. Sometimes that could be a while. I'm working a case right now that I've been working since 2014. And it's because I still have a concern of violence risk, and right now there is no way for us to put active management strategies on that subject. Our concern for violence risk is lower than it used to be because of where the subject is in their life right now, but I know based on that person's issues, psychopathy, that this person is at risk for committing violence again, and my client is one of the potential targets. So I'm still monitoring that case. And as I watch that person escalate over time through their posts online, then I would notify that client and say, hey, he's ratcheting up again. We need to get back up and provide a new intervention, a new boundary. So the monitoring can go on for quite a long time. Generally, if somebody has a conflict and we can resolve that conflict, or otherwise they let go of that conflict, they broke up with their spouse, they got divorced, and they're dating again, and they don't seem to be harboring any resentment toward that ex-spouse, then we could say, okay, we can lower our concern. There's never zero concern. It just is low concern. What happens when that new girlfriend breaks up with that guy? Who does he blame? The new girlfriend or the ex-spouse? Because cases will ratchet back up over time as new triggering events happen. So that's another consideration. We never shred a file in threat assessment.
By the way, we have so many wonderful questions. We're not going to be able to fit all of them in. I'm going to shoehorn in one question. And for those that we don't get to, I'm likely to reserve those for a panel discussion. But this question is, where do issues around gangs and groups in our communities relate to threat management? Since each year the deaths rise in our Black and brown communities. Mm-hmm. Now, when we talk about targeted violence, one of the struggles we have within our threat assessment community is what exactly is targeted violence? Because a gang hit is targeted violence. The victim was identified. That person may have procured a firearm, conducted surveillance, committed a targeted attack in a gang-motivated shooting because of arguments about territory for drug sales, something like that, or getting even for a member of their gang being shot and killed. Threat assessment does play a role in gang attacks. We haven't seen as much conversation about gangs and gang attacks in the targeted violence or the threat assessment community because we have been more focused on the mass shootings, terrorist attacks, the vehicular attacks, the bombings, and the other sort. But this methodology absolutely should be brought into gang task forces, into conversations about how to spot concerning behavior, how to identify when someone is thinking about committing an attack, and then preparing for it, and then moving to carry it out. It applies to all forms of violence. So we want to be thinking about spotting those concerns and intervening before somebody can commit that violent attack. And I one final question. This is more of a school setting question. So Often, kids and adolescents are being expelled from school after bringing in, a knife or a gun, often in response to, a series of bullying. These kids beforehand are often told, tell the teacher, tell the principal, and feel that nothing improves. How can we handle those situations better?
The folks at the Secret Service, after they did the exceptional case study project and created the threat assessment model, did a series of very good studies on what was called the Safe School Initiative. President Clinton asked the National Threat Assessment Center, what you did for presidential assassination, can you do that for the school shooting problem that we're having? That was when school shootings were on the rise. And so they did a very good study called the Bystander Effect. It's the bystander study. Why are people not reporting when there is a concern? In a number of the cases they studied, people knew that a shooting was going to happen. Why didn't they do anything about it? And one of the factors was just that, which is, if I report it, I'm the one who gets in trouble. So we need to change the culture. Encourage people to report. When they report, taking those reports seriously. Virginia, you may not be aware, that Virginia, after Virginia Tech, mandated threat assessment teams for all higher education higher education entities. After the Sandy Hook attack, Virginia mandated threat assessment for all K through 12. And they're the only state in the country, to the best of my knowledge, that has mandatory K through 12 threat assessment teams. The threat assessment team provides training to a group of core individuals to do what I just discussed. And it also sets up that reporting mechanism so that kids can feel safe in providing that tip. And there was a threat of violence at Riverdale High School in Virginia. You can look this up, Fredericksburg, Virginia, where the threat assessment team took in the tip, did their work, the police intervened, they found the firearms, the kid was ready to carry out the attack. And because that would-be attacker told a fellow student and that tip went in and was worked, assessed, and investigated, they prevented an attack. So that's the culture we want to set up, where kids can feel safe to report they have a concern, where you have a trained group of professionals who understand what threat assessment is and how to look into these cases, and leveraging law enforcement to conduct investigations, do their searches, identify that evidence that shows there is in fact a plot that is unfolding and an attack about to happen, and then prevent that attack from happening.